Tonight we walk together into a place the world map pretends is empty, a place where silence is supposed to rule forever. The ice stretches endlessly before you, white layered upon white, calm and merciless. And yet almost immediately a disturbing thought presses into your mind. The Arctic has records, names, counts, stories. Someone was here, someone stayed. So before I tell you today's story, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel to receive notifications for future clips and give me some encouragement. As you settle in, you're invited to share your local location and the current time where you're listening from, as if pinning your presence gently onto this global night. Now, let's begin our journey tonight. You stand at the edge of the polar world, breathing slowly, and the first thing you realize is how certain everyone has always sounded about this place. Too cold, too dark, too hostile, no agriculture, no cities, no civilization, just ice and survival, nothing more. That certainty is repeated so often that it feels like law, and yet, as you move deeper into the story, you begin to sense a fracture in that confidence. The Arctic records do not scream, they whisper. They appear in shipping logs that should list nothing but loss. They appear in imperial reports that hesitate, then move on too quickly. They appear in old encyclopedias where the wording feels strangely cautious, as if the author feared saying too much. You notice population numbers that do not match the environment. You notice trade references where trade should be impossible. And slowly, a realization settles in. Absence has been curated. You're told that civilizations bloom in warmth, that culture needs gentle seasons, that architecture requires stable ground. But what if that belief is comfort rather than truth? What if it is easier to believe life cannot exist here than to ask how it did? As you walk across this frozen narrative, the ice beneath your feet begins to feel thin, not physically but historically. Beneath it there are layers, older layers that suggest memory rather than emptiness. You begin with the Arctic as a concept, not a location, a boundary, a psychological edge. For centuries it has been described as the end of the world, a blank margin where maps dissolve into decoration. Sea monsters, wind gods, white nothingness. But boundaries are where stories hide best. Boundaries are where control is easiest. You notice something curious in early records. Explorers are not always surprised by what they find. Some arrive already expecting settlements. Others mention ruins as if they were anticipated, not discovered. Why would someone expect stonework in a frozen wasteland? Why would anyone bring measuring tools meant for cities into a land said to have none? As you read, you begin to feel that the Arctic is less a void and more a veil. You imagine the cold not as an enemy but as a cover. Ice preserves. Ice silences. Ice hides things patiently without malice. Entire landscapes can vanish beneath snowfall in a single season. Entire cities can sink into forgetfulness while remaining intact below, and you start to wonder, if a civilization wanted to disappear, or be made to disappear, what better place than a land everyone agrees is uninhabitable? This is where the name Tartaria begins to echo faintly, not loudly, not clearly. It does not announce itself. It drifts in sideways, in footnotes, in outdated atlases, in references that seem embarrassed by their own existence. A vast dominion, you are told, stretching across Asia, yet somehow brushing against the Arctic in ways that are never fully explained. You're not asked to believe anything yet, only to notice. Notice how the word unexplored often replaces erased. Notice how nomadic is sometimes used where settled would raise questions. Notice how cold is treated as a final answer rather than a variable. As you listen, your breathing slows. The story does not rush you. It walks, and with every step you feel the contradiction growing stronger. Human beings are adaptable. They live in deserts, jungles, mountains, and oceans. They build underground. They build upward. They build inward. But here, suddenly, they are said to give up entirely. You pause on that thought, letting it rest. The Arctic night stretches long, and long nights are good for memory. In places where the sun disappears for months, people do not forget easily. They tell stories, they mark cycles, they measure the sky carefully because the sky becomes their calendar, their clock, their comfort. You begin to imagine a civilization that did not fear darkness, but understood it. And then comes the unsettling question, the one that sits quietly beside you rather than confronting you directly. If people lived here, truly lived here, what did they know that we forgot? Or worse, What did they know that someone else decided we should never remember? You think about how history is often described as fragile, yet it survives wars, fires, and collapses. What history rarely survives is editing. A single decision about what counts as impossible can erase centuries with a straight face. The Arctic records feel edited. You imagine scholars turning pages and stopping, hesitating, choosing simpler explanations, choosing cold over complexity, choosing emptiness over intelligence. And you do not judge them harshly. Simplicity is comforting, mystery is not. The wind moves across the ice, and in that sound you almost hear footsteps. Not literal ones, memory steps, patterns repeating. The sense that you are not the first person to stand here and feel this unease. This story is not about proving anything to anyone. It is not about shouting or persuading. It is about sitting with the idea that history may have been shaped as much by silence as by events, that the Arctic may not be a dead end, but a locked room. You're still at the threshold. Nothing has been claimed yet. Nothing has been revealed fully. You are simply standing in a place where certainty weakens, where the cold no longer feels empty, and where the first quiet truth begins to form. A civilization may have existed exactly where you were told none ever could, and as the ice creaks softly beneath your thoughts, you continue forward, slowly, calmly, ready to listen to what the white world has been keeping to itself. You move forward without leaving the Arctic behind, because now the ice travels with you, onto paper, into ink, into the careful hands of old map makers who once tried to describe the world without fully understanding it. You lean over these maps as if over a sleeping body, and the first thing you notice is that the Arctic is not always blank. In some of the oldest charts, the white space is disturbed, lines appear where none should exist, coastlines curl inward with confidence, rivers run confidently toward a polar sea, and written beside them are words, names placed with the calm certainty of someone who believes the land is known. This is where the whisper begins to grow clearer. You notice that early maps do not treat the Arctic as a mystery, but as a region awaiting clarification. It is not labelled void, it is not surrounded by warning symbols. Instead, it carries notes, territories, peoples, routes. The shock does not come from what is drawn, but from how casually it is drawn. As if this information were once ordinary. You trace a finger along one of these lines and ask yourself a quiet question: who told them this? Mapmakers did not invent geography. They compiled it. They listened. They collected reports from travellers, traders, emissaries, and survivors. A map is never a guess. It is a confession of sources, and so you begin to wonder about those sources. Some maps show vast northern regions connected seamlessly to Tartaria, not as a fringe, but as an extension, dramatic border, no sense of transition from civilized to wild, just continuity. You notice how unsettling that feels, because you have been taught to expect a hard stop, a wall of ice where history gives up. But these maps do not give up. They include strange symbols near the pole, circles, grids, radiating lines. Some call them artistic flourishes. Others say they represent currents, winds, or magnetic forces. But as you stare longer, they begin to resemble planning. Design. Order imposed where chaos is expected. Why decorate emptiness so carefully? You find annotations that feel oddly apologetic, as if the cartographer is unsure whether future readers will accept what is shown. Words like said to be, reported by, according to northern accounts. These phrases feel defensive, not imaginative. The mapmaker is not dreaming, he is shielding himself. You imagine him working by candlelight, aware that his map may someday be questioned, revised, simplified. He draws anyway, because someone told him these things existed. And then you notice what happens later. As centuries pass, the maps change. Not because new discoveries contradict the old ones, but because the old ones are quietly removed. Names vanish, details blur, regions become vague. The Arctic retreats into abstraction. What was once specific becomes symbolic. What was once described becomes undefined. You realize that this is not how knowledge usually evolves. Normally, details increase, borders sharpen, names multiply. Here, the opposite happens. Information drains away. You begin to feel the presence of choice. You notice that some of the most detailed Arctic maps appear just before major shifts in global power. Empires rise, trade routes change, control over knowledge becomes as important as control over land, and suddenly, the far north is no longer useful as a place of memory. it becomes useful as a place of nothing. You sit with that thought, letting it settle. The idea that emptiness can be manufactured is unsettling. It means that forgetting is not always accidental. Sometimes it is strategic. If no one believes anything was ever there, no one will ask where it went. You look again at the strange polar features, lands drawn as islands where modern maps show open sea, seas drawn where now there is ice. You are told these were errors, ice movement, primitive instruments, and perhaps some were, but the confidence of repetition nags at you. The same features appear across different maps, from different regions, drawn by people who never met. Coincidence begins to feel like a weak explanation. You imagine travellers describing northern cities in hushed tones, describing warmth where there should be cold, describing stone structures aligned not to the sun, but to the sky's slow rotation, describing a place that does not behave like the rest of the world, and then you imagine those descriptions being filtered, softened, filed away, reduced to curiosities rather than truths. Maps are political instruments, even when they pretend not to be. What is included gains legitimacy. What is omitted becomes legend. You realise that the Arctic's transformation into a blank space is one of the most successful acts of historical storytelling ever performed. You are told nothing was there, so you never look for ruins. You are told no one lived there, so population records are dismissed as mistakes. You are told no one could survive there, so evidence becomes anomaly. And anomalies are easy to ignore. The name Tartaria appears again, faint but persistent, stretching farther north than feels comfortable. Not as a conqueror, but as a presence. As if its influence did not fear cold, Seniat. As if it understood something fundamental about the Earth that later civilizations forgot. You ask yourself another quiet question. What if the Arctic was not always as cold as it is now? Or what if cold was not the obstacle we assume it to be? What if technology, design, or knowledge made temperature a manageable variable rather than a death sentence? The maps do not answer you. They simply wait. You notice how modern reproductions often crop the top of old maps. The pole is trimmed away, the most inconvenient area removed for clarity. It feels small, almost petty, yet symbolically heavy. The edge of the world is always the easiest place to edit. As you sit with these maps, the lullaby rhythm of the story deepens. The ink lines blur gently in your mind like veins beneath skin. The Arctic no longer feels distant. It feels close, intimate, watched. You begin to sense that maps are not just representations of space, but of belief. At one time, someone believed the North was inhabited, structured, meaningful. Later, someone else believed it was better to say it was not. And belief, once printed, becomes truth. The shock is not that the maps might be wrong, the shock is that they might be right, and that the world decided not to follow them. You roll the maps away carefully, as if tucking them back into sleep. They have done their work. They have planted an unease that does not demand action, only awareness. The Arctic is no longer a void in your mind. It is a question mark drawn with deliberate lines. And as you continue your journey, you carry this with you. The understanding that before ruins are buried in snow, before names are erased from memory, they are first erased from maps. The ice outside remains silent, but the paper has spoken. You drift onward from the maps, carrying their quiet discomfort with you. And now you begin to hear something else. Names. Not spoken aloud, but repeating softly across documents, reports, and half-forgotten texts. Names that feel out of place. Names that do not behave like accidents. In the far north, where modern language expects silence, you find words lingering. Place names that appear more than once. River names written in unfamiliar tongues. Regions labelled with confidence, not guesswork. And the more you listen to them, the more you realise they are doing something strange. They are refusing to fade. You pause on one name, then another. Different spellings, different alphabets, same sound, same rhythm. As if the name itself is trying to survive translation. You begin to understand that names are among the hardest things to erase. Buildings can be buried, populations can be moved, but names cling. They lodge themselves into memory and pass quietly from mouth to mouth. Why would the Arctic need names at all? You're told that nomads do not name extensively, that transient people pass through without marking, yet these names feel anchored. They describe not movement but belonging. They imply permanence. They imply return. You imagine generations repeating them, not as curiosities, but as references. Meet me here. Travel there. Avoid this place, honor that one. You notice that some names are descriptive, related to heat, light, protection, gathering. Others feel ceremonial, almost reverent. Names for hills, names for crossings, names for what sounds like centers. This is not the language of survival alone. It is the language of culture. And culture, you remind yourself gently, does not bloom overnight. As you continue, you realize something unsettling. Many of these northern names are later relabeled, not translated. Replaced. A familiar tactic. When a name carries memory, you swap it for something neutral. A number. A direction. A generic descriptor. The land remains, but its voice is silenced. You feel the weight of that. You imagine an elder pointing toward the horizon, teaching a child the old words, teaching them not just where a place is, but what it means. You imagine those words surviving winters, storms, centuries, only to be overwritten by someone who never asked what they meant. Some records treat these names as oddities. Others dismiss them as errors. A few acknowledge them briefly, then move on. But the repetition continues, like a soft knock that never quite stops. You begin to sense that language itself is acting as evidence. Names often preserve what history denies. A valley called Warm Ground in a frozen region raises questions. A settlement name that implies walls or gathering suggests more than tents. A coastal feature named for ships implies traffic, not isolation. You're not rushing to conclusions. You are simply noticing patterns. As your breathing slows, you allow yourself to imagine how these names might have sounded when spoken aloud under a polar sky. The way sound carries in cold air, the way stories would be told inside enclosed spaces, while the wind pressed against walls. The names would not be decorative. They would be functional, protective, remembered for a reason. And then you notice another detail. Some of these names appear far from the Arctic as well, attached to different locations, like echoes, as if a people moved or were moved and carried their language with them, or as if the same culture once spanned distances that later seemed impossible. The thought does not alarm you. It settles beside you, patient. You realize that modern history prefers clean categories. Settled versus nomadic, civilized versus primitive, warm versus cold, but names do not respect those divisions. They slip between them, carrying nuance that textbooks often smooth away. You come across scholars who tried to explain these names away. They suggest coincidence, mishearing, translation errors, and sometimes that may be true, but you also notice something else. How quickly alternative explanations are abandoned. How rarely anyone asks why the same errors occur again and again in the same places. At some point, error begins to look like pattern. You think about how children learn geography, through repetition, through names attached to stories. Remove the story and the name becomes meaningless. Remove the name and the story cannot be told at all. You begin to see how fragile collective memory really is. And yet, here these names are, still visible, still audible if you lean in. You imagine the people who used them not as abstractions but as human beings. People who woke each day in a land of ice and did not consider it impossible. People who adapted, engineered, planned. People who named their world because they expected to remain in it. You feel a quiet respect forming, not dramatic, not emotional, just steady. The name Tartaria brushes against this layer again, not loudly but persistently. In some records, northern names are linked linguistically to Tartarian roots. Shared structures, shared meanings. This does not prove unity, but it suggests conversation, exchange, familiarity. And familiarity implies time. You think about how long it takes for language to settle into land, how many seasons it takes before a name feels inevitable rather than invented. You imagine children correcting outsiders who mispronounce it. You imagine songs that include it, lullabies perhaps sung during long nights. This is not the Arctic as a temporary refuge. This is the Arctic as home. You begin to understand why names are dangerous to certain narratives. They are stubborn. They invite questions, they demand explanation. An explanation leads to curiosity, which leads to doubt. So the names are softened, or labelled uncertain, or footnoted into obscurity. But you are here now listening. The Arctic around you no longer feels mute. It feels like it is humming quietly beneath the ice, like a voice trapped under frozen water. The names are part of that hum. They do not shout, they do not accuse, they simply exist. You let them exist without forcing meaning onto them, and in doing so you feel something shift. The idea that civilization requires comfort begins to weaken. The idea that history is straightforward begins to loosen. You are not uncovering a secret so much as allowing an old truth to breathe again. The wind outside is steady. The rhythm of the story remains slow. There is no urgency here, only continuity, one layer leading gently to the next. As you prepare to move on, you carry the names with you, not as proof, not as argument, but as companions. They have survived longer than empires, longer than borders, longer than certainty, and you realize, as sleep begins to edge closer, that if a place has names, it was never empty. You move deeper now, leaving names behind like soft footprints in snow, and you enter a colder place, not of temperature, but of record. This is where empires keep their numbers, ledgers, tallies, lists written with the confidence of authority. You step quietly into these cold libraries, and what you find there does not scream mystery, it whispers contradiction. You are told that the far north held only scattered tribes, transient lives, minimal impact. And yet the records do not behave that way. They count, they inventory, they categorize, and you begin to notice that the numbers feel crowded. You sit with one report, then another. Fur taxes collected in quantities too large for a handful of hunters. Grain shipments recorded where agriculture should not exist. Tools catalogued not as curiosities, but as standard equipment. And most unsettling of all, people counted not individually, but collectively. Villages, districts, populations. You let that word rest for a moment. Population. Empires do not count ghosts. They count what they can extract from, what they can govern, what they can control. To be counted is to exist officially. And the North, according to these ledgers, existed far more than it was supposed to. You imagine clerks working in distant capitals, far from the ice, copying numbers sent from the frontier. They trust the figures because bureaucracy depends on trust. If the North were truly empty, these documents would collapse under their own absurdity. But they did not. They persisted. They were updated, revised, expanded. You notice how casually the North is treated in some of these texts. Not as a mystery, not as a frontier of chaos, but as another administrative zone. Difficult, yes. Remote, yes, but real. And then you notice something else. Over time, the language changes. Earlier documents speak plainly. Later ones hedge. Numbers shrink without explanation. Categories merge. Regions are renamed. What was once specific becomes vague. What was once measured becomes estimated. You feel the hand of revision again, not dramatic, not violent, but careful. You begin to understand how history can be cooled just like land. Remove the warmth of detail and life becomes harder to imagine. You follow references to labour, people assigned to tasks that imply infrastructure, maintenance, transport, construction. These are not the activities of a purely nomadic culture passing through ice. These are the rhythms of settlement. You picture warehouses near frozen rivers, storage adapted to cold, not defeated by it. You picture schedules aligned to seasons of darkness and light, not chaos. The idea no longer feels strange, it feels logical. Empires are practical. They do not romanticize, they exploit, and they exploit what exists. You notice mentions of tribute that make no sense if the region were barren. Metal, timber, manufactured goods, not raw survival materials, but finished ones. Someone was refining, someone was organizing labor. Someone was producing surplus. Surplus is the quiet signature of civilization. You breathe slowly as the realization settles. These libraries are not telling fairy tales. They are telling uncomfortable truths in a language so dry that it almost hides them. Numbers rarely lie intentionally. They lie by omission. You imagine later historians reading these same ledgers and feeling uneasy. Faced with data that contradicts climate assumptions, they choose the safer explanation: exaggeration, error, misclassification. It is easier to doubt the North than to rethink the limits of human capability. You do not blame them. Paradigms are heavy things to lift. But here, in the quiet of this story, you allow the numbers to stand without immediate judgment. You allow them to be strange. You allow them to suggest that the Arctic was not an edge, but a node. You notice how trade flows implied by these records connect north to south, east to west. The Arctic is not isolated in these documents. It is connected, integrated, part of something larger. The name Tartaria does not dominate these pages, but it lingers like a watermark. Administrative overlaps, shared terminology, familiar structures. It feels less like conquest and more like coherence. You imagine a world where cold regions were valued not despite the climate, but because of it. Ice as preservation, darkness as rhythm, distance as protection. You imagine planners who thought in centuries, not seasons, and then you notice the sudden quiet. At a certain point, the records thin dramatically, not gradually, but abruptly, as if someone closed a book and did not reopen it. The north fades from administrative concern, populations vanish from tallies, trade becomes sporadic, then symbolic. You feel the presence of an ending, though it has not yet been explained. You close the ledger gently as one closes something fragile. The cold libraries have done their work. They have shown you that emptiness was not always assumed, that official systems once acknowledged life where modern narratives deny it. As you step away, the Arctic feels less distant than ever, not because it is warm, but because it is familiar, structured, remembered even if imperfectly. The story continues to move forward, unhurried. You are not being convinced, you are being accompanied. The numbers walk beside you now, steady and quiet, like lanterns in the dark. And as sleep draws a little closer, you hold one simple thought. Where there are ledgers, there were lives. You leave the libraries behind, but their weight stays with you as you step back into the cold. Now the story lowers its voice even more, because what comes next is not written confidently in ink. It is written in reports, rumours, and half-believed discoveries. You are following the trail of ruins. In the Arctic, ruin is a strange word. You are taught to imagine ice swallowing everything, grinding stone to nothing, leaving no trace. And yet again and again you encounter the same unsettling phrase in old accounts. Structures observed. Not tents, not temporary shelters, structures. You picture explorers pausing, confused, staring at stone emerging from snow. Walls aligned too precisely to be natural. Foundations exposed briefly during a thaw, then covered again. Streets, yes, streets, described not as guesses, but as measurements. You let the image form slowly. A city does not need to be large to be significant. It needs only to be deliberate, and deliberateness is what keeps appearing. Some accounts mention buildings partially submerged in permafrost, their upper levels intact, their lower levels swallowed by time. Others describe domed roofs protruding like rounded hills, mistaken for natural formations until examined closely. The earth in the Arctic does not erode the way it does elsewhere. It locks things in place. Ice, you begin to understand, is not destruction. It is storage. You think about how many ancient cities elsewhere were lost to heat, vegetation, water, human reuse. The Arctic has none of these forces. It has patience, it waits. You notice how often these ruin reports are followed by uncertainty, possibly natural, unclear origin, no further investigation conducted. The phrasing feels defensive, as if the observer does not trust what their eyes are showing them. You imagine being one of them, standing in silence, the wind cutting through layers of clothing, the ground beneath your feet shaped by human intention. What do you do with that realization? Do you report it plainly and risk disbelief? Or do you soften it, hoping someone else will ask the hard questions later? Many did the latter. You follow references to stone that should not exist in such quantity so far north. Quarried blocks, mortar, techniques that imply skilled labour and long-term planning. Not survival architecture, but civic architecture. You pause on the idea of streets again. Streets mean traffic. They mean design. They mean people moving with purpose, not just sheltering from cold. You imagine snow falling softly over these paths, season after season, until the city becomes a ghost beneath a white blanket. Not destroyed, simply forgotten. There are mentions of metal fixtures embedded in stone, of glass fragments found far from any known trade source, of symmetry that nature does not favour. Each detail on its own can be dismissed. Together they form a pattern that resists sleep. And yet sleep is exactly what the Arctic demands. Long nights, long silences, long gaps between visits, a perfect environment for ruins to remain unchallenged. You notice that when modern expeditions find similar features, the language changes again. Unusual formations, naturally occurring, glacial anomalies. The vocabulary grows thick, technical, insulating. Mystery is wrapped in jargon and placed out of reach. You do not feel anger at this, only a mild sadness, a sense of something missed. You imagine the people who once walked these streets. You do not dress them in fantasy or exaggeration. You see them as practical, focused. calm. They knew the rhythms of this land. They built in harmony with it, not defiance. They planned for cold, not against it. Their buildings may have captured heat, redirected wind, stored light, or perhaps they relied on technologies we no longer recognize because we stopped looking for them. You think about how the word primitive has been misused, how often it means we do not understand, how often it masks sophistication that does not resemble our own. The ruins do not speak loudly. They do not rise dramatically from the ice like monuments begging for attention. They are modest, integrated, almost shy. And that may be why they survived. You begin to sense that this civilization, whatever we call it, did not build to impress future generations. It built to endure its present. The name Tartaria brushes past again lightly. Some ruin locations align suspiciously with regions once associated with it. Trade networks implied by earlier sections begin to feel physically grounded, not theoretical, tangible. You realize that ruins are the most dangerous evidence of all because they can be visited, touched, measured, and so they are often left unexplored, their coordinates vague, their descriptions brief. You step away from the imagined stones gently, as if not to wake them. They have waited long enough. As you continue, the story remains soft, unhurried. You are not being led toward certainty, but toward humility. The understanding that history may be far more adaptable than the climate models we project backward. The Arctic, once empty in your mind, now feels inhabited by absence, not emptiness, but loss. And as the snow begins to fall again in your imagination, you carry with you a quiet truth. Cities do not disappear because they never existed. They disappear because no one was listening when they went silent. You move onward from the buried streets, and now your eyes lift upward, drawn not to what lies beneath the snow, but to what once reached above it. The records change texture here. Less about foundations, more about height. Less about shelter, more about intention. You begin to encounter descriptions of towers. Not watchtowers in the military sense, not crude markers of defense. These are described differently. Tall, narrow, deliberate, often domed, often crowned, often placed where the sky feels close as if the builders were not only inhabiting the land, but addressing something above it. You imagine them rising from the ice, slender and patient, holding their shape against wind and time. You are told that such structures make no sense here, that height is a liability in storms, that cold punishes exposure, and yet the descriptions persist. Some towers are said to be hollow, their interiors protected from the wind, warm enough to stand within for long periods. Others are described as layered, with chambers aligned vertically, as if designed to move air, sound, or something less tangible. You're not told exactly what they were for, only that they were there. You feel a familiar patterns returning. Confidence in observation, hesitation in explanation. You consider how towers function elsewhere in the world. They mark centers. They signal coordination. They anchor space. In many cultures, towers are not practical necessities, but symbolic statements. We are here. We understand this place. We are not temporary. And suddenly the Arctic feels different again. You imagine a landscape where towers were not exceptions but reference points, where travellers navigated by them during long periods of low visibility, where communities oriented themselves around vertical landmarks that stood out against the flatness of ice and tundra. You think about domes in particular. Domes distribute stress. They conserve heat. They resonate sound. They are efficient, not decorative. Their shape is found in nature, not because it is beautiful, but because it works. Why would a civilization in the far north choose domes unless they had tested them, refined them, trusted them? Some accounts describe these towers as metallic in part, or capped with materials that reflected light faintly even under low sun. Others mention faint sounds during certain atmospheric conditions, a hum, a vibration, easily dismissed yet noted. You do not rush to interpret this, you simply let it sit. You recall how many ancient cultures built upward to interact with the sky, to track stars, to observe cycles, to measure time when the ground offered no clear markers. In the Arctic, the sky is not just scenery, it is a system. Auroras, long nights, shifting magnetic fields. The heavens behave differently here. You begin to suspect that these towers were not defying the Arctic, but working with it. You imagine standing inside one during polar night. The outside world silent, frozen, endless. Inside, warmth held carefully. Light stored, redirected, perhaps even generated, the tower becoming a mediator between us earth and its sky. This is where the story grows more delicate. Some records hint that these structures were not only architectural but functional in ways we no longer categorize easily. They are not described as temples, not as fortresses, not as dwellings. They sit uncomfortably between categories, like tools for a purpose that no longer has a name. You notice how quickly later commentators label them ritualistic, a word that often means we don't know and we're done trying. Ritual implies irrationality. It absolves the observer from further curiosity. But nothing you've encountered so far feels irrational. It feels methodical, calm, quietly advanced. You think again of Tartaria, not as an empire of banners and armies, but as a network of shared knowledge, a civilization that valued alignment, resonance, efficiency. If such a culture extended into the Arctic, towers would make sense. They would be anchors, instruments, interfaces. You're not imagining laser beams or dramatic forces, you're imagining something subtler. Control of environment, awareness of cycles, technologies that do not announce themselves loudly, but integrate so smoothly that later generations forget they are technologies at all. You notice how some towers are described as still standing long after surrounding structures collapsed or were buried. Vertical forms survive snow differently, they shed accumulation, they remain visible longer. They become myths when their context disappears. You imagine later travelers seeing these lonely spires and inventing stories around them, calling them markers of giants, or remnants of a lost race, or natural anomalies, anything but what they might actually be. You feel no urgency to decide. The lullaby rhythm deepens here. The towers feel like sentinels in your mind, not threatening, not commanding, just present. They have watched centuries pass without comment. You think about how modern cities still build towers, not because they are necessary, but because they mean something. Power, coordination, identity. Height is language, and you ask yourself gently, what was being said in the Arctic, and to whom? Some speculate that these towers interacted with atmospheric phenomena. Others suggest they tracked celestial movements unique to high latitudes. Still others whisper about energy, ambient, environmental, subtle. The records never clarify, they simply note the structures and move on. You respect that restraint. The danger of this story is not that it suggests too much, but that it invites you to sit with not knowing, to resist the impulse to label and dismiss, to accept that human ingenuity may have taken forms that do not resemble our current imagination. You begin to understand why such structures would be inconvenient to history. They challenge the timeline, they challenge assumptions, they suggest continuity where rupture is expected, and so they fade. They are photographed rarely, investigated briefly, explained away quickly. But in this quiet space before sleep fully claims you, you allow yourself to see them clearly. Tall against the ice, purposeful, calm, they do not demand belief, they do not demand awe. They simply stand asking one soft question that echoes upward into the dark sky. What else did we once know how to build? The wind moves around the towers in your imagination, slow and steady. You move with it, unafraid. The journey continues, not toward answers, but toward deeper listening. You drift onward, past the towers that remember the sky, and now the story turns inward, into warmth. Not imagined warmth, not metaphorical comfort, but recorded heat. This is where the contradiction sharpens, because the Arctic, you have been told, does not forgive cold. And yet the records begin to hint at something impossible. Systems of warmth where fire alone would never be enough. You move carefully here, because this is where myth and memory blur most easily. In the margins of reports, in the phrasing of travellers who did not know the right words, you find references to interiors that remained warm without visible flame, to halls where air circulated gently, evenly, as if guided, to dwellings that did not choke with smoke, yet did not freeze. The descriptions are hesitant, almost embarrassed. You imagine the observers struggling to explain what they experienced using only the tools of their own understanding. Fire equals heat. No fire equals cold. Anything else sounds like fantasy. And so they choose careful language. Strange warmth. Unclear source. Possibly underground. But underground alone does not explain consistency. You begin to sense that what you are touching now is not a single invention, but a philosophy. A way of thinking about energy not as something to be burned, but something to be guided, harvested, balanced. In a land where fuel is scarce and resupply uncertain, inefficiency is not an option. You think about how many ancient cultures understood principles we later forgot. Passive heating, thermal mass, airflow design, orientation to wind and sun. These are not modern ideas. They are old ones, rediscovered and rebranded. But here in the Arctic, those ideas would have had to be taken further. Some accounts describe floors that remained warm underfoot even in deep winter. Walls that did not radiate cold. Spaces where condensation behaved strangely, as if moisture was being managed deliberately. These are not miracles. They are engineering solutions, quiet ones. You imagine builders who understood the movement of air like a living thing, who designed spaces to breathe slowly, steadily, without drafts, who captured what little solar energy existed and stored it, redistributed it, stretched it across long nights. And then there are the stranger hints, mentions of stone that gives warmth, of metal elements embedded in walls whose purpose is never explained, of structures aligned not just to the sun, but to the earth itself. You do not leap to conclusions. You let the images float. You remember the towers of Ur, their verticality, their possible interaction with atmosphere. You begin to wonder whether heating was not always localized, whether warmth was not always produced in one place and consumed in another, whether energy was ambient, environmental, shared. This is where some people would begin to speak loudly of free energy, of lost technologies, of suppression. You resist that urge, not because it is wrong, but because it is too sharp for this moment. Tonight, the story asks you to soften, not to provoke. Instead, you think about necessity. A civilization that thrives in extreme cold cannot afford waste. It must understand energy deeply, intimately. It must see heat not as something to create constantly, but as something to conserve, to circulate, to respect. Fire becomes a last resort, not a foundation. You imagine communal hearths not as roaring centers, but as subtle contributors to a larger system. You imagine buildings working together, sharing warmth through proximity, through design, through alignment. You notice that later observers often interpret these systems as primitive, because they do not see chimneys or furnaces. They mistake absence of smoke for absence of sophistication. A dangerous assumption. You feel a quiet admiration forming, not romantic, not exaggerated, just a recognition of intelligence shaped by environment rather than convenience. The paradox deepens when you realize that such systems would leave little trace once abandoned. No massive engines, no fuel stockpiles, no dramatic ruins, just stone and silence, easy to overlook, easy to deny. You think about how modern heating relies on constant input. Fuel, electricity, infrastructure. Remove that input and the system collapses. But what if these Arctic systems were designed to persist, to fail slowly, to degrade gracefully, to continue offering shelter even when maintenance stopped? That would explain something unsettling, how structures remained usable long after their builders were gone. You imagine later peoples moving into these spaces, benefiting from warmth they did not fully understand. You imagine stories forming, legends of enchanted buildings, places that felt alive, places that were respected, then feared. You also imagine how threatening such knowledge would be to emerging powers elsewhere. Energy independence is dangerous. It cannot be taxed easily. It resists control. A society that does not rely on fuel supply chains is difficult to dominate. You let that thought rest without judgment. The Arctic night grows longer in your imagination, but you are not cold. The story itself seems to insulate you. The idea that human beings once mastered warmth without conquest, without excess, without spectacle feels strangely calming. You begin to understand that technology does not always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it hides in plain sight. Sometimes it survives precisely because it does not look like technology at all. You remember how often modern archaeologists struggle to identify tools that do not fit expectations, how often they are labelled ritual or symbolic and set aside. You wonder how many heating systems were dismissed because they did not burn. The records never give you a full diagram, they never explain the mechanism completely, and perhaps that is fitting. Knowledge does not always survive intact. Sometimes it survives as impression, as effect, as a feeling of warmth in a place that should be deadly. You feel that warmth now, not physically but mentally. The Arctic no longer feels hostile, it feels misunderstood. You move slowly, gently, letting the paradox remain unresolved. The hearth technology paradox is not meant to be solved tonight. It is meant to change how you think about what is possible. As the wind outside your imagined shelter settles, you carry one quiet realization with you. A civilization capable of mastering warmth in the coldest place on Earth was not primitive, not accidental, and not helpless. It was deliberate, and as you continue your journey, wrapped in this steady, unspoken heat, you begin to sense that the greatest technologies are not always the ones that burn brightest, but the ones that endure longest. You move forward, carried by that quiet warmth, and now your attention settles on the hands of this forgotten civilization, the things they made, the materials they shaped, the tools they left behind. This is where the Arctic becomes most unsettling, because what is found there does not match the story of isolation or simplicity. You encounter descriptions of metalwork first, not crude, not improvised, but refined. Smoothed surfaces, consistent alloys, edges too precise to be accidental. The kind of metal that requires controlled heat, steady processes, and practiced skill. And yet this metal appears far from any known source of fuel or supply. You pause on that contradiction. Smelting is not a casual activity. It demands infrastructure, knowledge, time. It demands a settled workforce and repeatability. And here in the polar regions, you find references to tools and fittings that suggest not experimentation, but routine. You imagine workshops insulated against the cold, furnaces designed for efficiency, not spectacle. You imagine craftsmen working calmly, not desperately, confident that their environment could support such work. This is not survival metal, this is civic metal. You notice that some tools are described as silent in use. No heavy hammering, no dramatic sparks. The language suggests precision rather than force. Instruments for measurement, components that fit together cleanly, parts of systems rather than standalone objects. You think about how modern industry values loudness, machines announcing their power through noise, but quiet systems often indicate refinement, balance, maturity that no longer needs to prove itself. Glass appears next, and it unsettles you even more. Fragments of glass in the Arctic are difficult to explain away. Glass is fragile. It does not travel well. It does not survive easily unless protected, and yet pieces are reported, sometimes clear, sometimes tinted, sometimes patterned. Not beads, not trinkets, flat surfaces, curved panes, as if part of windows, lenses, or coverings. You imagine structures designed to admit light during rare sun periods, to magnify it, redirect it, soften it. Glass becomes not decoration, but necessity. In a land starved of light, every photon matters. You realize how much planning that implies. You're not seeing a people reacting to the Arctic, you're seeing a people who studied it, who optimized their materials accordingly, metal for strength, glass for light, stone for stability, each element chosen deliberately. You notice mentions of tools whose purpose is unclear, devices described only by shape, smooth cylinders, hollow frames, latticed components. Later scholars struggle to categorize them. Are they weapons, instruments, ritual objects? You resist the temptation to label them. You remember how many modern devices would confuse a past observer, how easily a radio could become a ritual box, how easily a sensor could become a ceremonial object. Function is invisible without context. You imagine these tools working together, metal guiding energy, glass shaping perception, stone grounding everything. A technological ecosystem that does not separate function from environment. You notice how rarely weapons are emphasized in these material findings. They exist, but they are not dominant. The tools of daily life appear more frequently, measuring, building, maintaining. This suggests a society oriented towards stability rather than conquest. And yet the refinement itself implies protection. A civilization capable of producing such materials would have needed to defend them, not necessarily through aggression, but through control of knowledge. You think about Tartaria again, this time not as a political entity, but as a technological lineage. A shared understanding passed across regions. If this knowledge reached the Arctic, it would not have arrived as raw instruction, it would have arrived as adaptation. You feel the weight of that inheritance. Some records mention that when later groups encountered these tools, they could use them, but not replicate them. The designs were simple to operate, but difficult to reproduce. That is often the mark of advanced engineering, ease of use, complexity of creation. You imagine a world where technology was not proprietary, but contextual. It worked best in the hands of those who understood the land. Remove it from that context and it becomes inert, mystifying. This may explain why so much was lost so quickly. When a system depends on understanding rather than force, it cannot survive abrupt cultural breaks. Knowledge is fragile when it is not written down, when it is taught through practice, through apprenticeship, through lived experience. You imagine the last craftsman teaching fewer and fewer students. You imagine interruptions, displacement, silence, tools continuing to exist long after their meaning faded. You feel no drama in this, only a slow sadness. The Arctic preserves objects well, but it does not preserve explanations. It keeps shapes, not stories. And later observers, lacking context, project their own assumptions onto what they find. You think about how easily we dismiss what we cannot classify, how quickly we reach for the word unknown and stop there. You sense that many of these tools are still waiting, not to be rediscovered, but to be understood differently. You let your thoughts slow further. The rhythm of the story remains even. The tools do not clatter or shine. They rest quietly in your mind like artifacts laid out on felt, inviting contemplation rather than excitement. You realize that technology does not always mark progress through escalation. Sometimes it marks wisdom through restraint, the ability to do much with little, to integrate rather than dominate. As you prepare to move on, you carry one gentle realization. A civilization capable of shaping metal and glass in the Arctic was not improvising, it was mastering. And mastery, when it fades, leaves behind silence rather than ruins. The snow settles again, the tools sleep, and you continue your journey, unhurried, curious, calm. You move onward, and now the story stretches horizontally. After towers and tools, after warmth and stone, your attention shifts to movement, not vertical. Not inward, but outward, across the land, across the ice, across distances that modern thinking insists were impassable. This is where the idea of roads enters the Arctic quietly and uncomfortably. You are told there were no roads here, no need for them, no permanence to justify them. And yet, as you listen more carefully, you begin to encounter lines again, not on maps this time, but in reports. Straight paths, repeated routes, compressed ground, ice worn smooth not by chance but by passage. You imagine walking across tundra and sensing that something beneath your feet is different, firmer, more intentional, as if the land itself remembers being used. Roads are not just paths, they are commitments. They say, we will come back. They say, this connection matters enough to maintain. In a harsh environment, roads are declarations of confidence. You pause with that idea. Some accounts describe raised causeways, slightly elevated strips of earth or stone designed to stay visible above snow. Others mention routes that follow magnetic lines or natural wind patterns, minimizing drift. These are not accidents. They are solutions shaped by long familiarity. You picture caravans moving slowly but steadily, not hurried, not desperate, loaded with goods that justify the journey. Metal, glass, food, knowledge. You hear the soft rhythm of movement rather than struggle. You think about how trade networks function. They require trust, predictability, infrastructure. They require rest points, storage, shelter. A single road implies many unseen supports. Roads do not exist alone. You begin to sense how deeply this challenges the idea of Arctic isolation. Some routes are said to cross frozen seas during specific seasons, returning year after year when conditions align. Ice as road, sea as land. Timing becomes everything. You imagine people who understood ice not as chaos, but as calendar, who knew when it would hold and when it would break. That kind of knowledge does not come quickly. It comes from generations watching, remembering, passing down precise observations. You realize again that this was not a temporary occupation. It was a long relationship. You notice that many of these routes connect north to south, linking Arctic settlements to regions long associated with Tartaria. This is not presented as conquest. It feels more like circulation, like arteries feeding a body. You consider how goods move today, how dependent modern society is on logistics, how roads define power. To control movement is to shape reality. If such networks existed in the Arctic, then the North was not peripheral, it was integrated. You feel the weight of that integration. Later historians often describe Arctic travel as heroic, exceptional, rare, but these older records describe it as scheduled, expected, almost routine. The difference is subtle, but profound. You imagine travellers stopping at known points, warming themselves, exchanging news. You imagine children growing up knowing that distant places were reachable, not mythical. You imagine a mental map far richer than the one you were taught. And then you notice the erasure again. Roads disappear first when history is rewritten. They require maintenance. They are visible. They invite questions, let them fade, and movement becomes impossible in memory, even if it once was common. You realize that many modern expeditions follow new routes that align suspiciously with old ones. The land remembers even when people forget. Packed earth does not loosen easily. Ice paths reform where they once held. You imagine the Arctic as a web rather than a void. Threads crossing and recrossing, invisible until you know how to look. There is something deeply calming about this realization. Movement implies life continuing day after day, not drama, not catastrophe, just rhythm. You think about how trade shapes culture, how ideas travel with goods, how language spreads along roads, how technology does not leap, but walks. If Tartarian knowledge reached the Arctic, roads would have been its veins. Quiet, efficient, uncelebrated. And if Arctic knowledge travelled south, it would have done the same. You begin to understand why this part of the story is so rarely emphasized. Roads suggest equality, exchange, mutual benefit. They undermine narratives of dominance and savagery. They suggest that people met one another as partners, not as discoverers and discovered. You do not need to imagine grand highways. Simple, reliable routes are enough to connect lives, enough to build memory. You feel the story slowing again, like footsteps settling into a steady pace. The wind no longer howls, it guides. You imagine standing at a crossroads in the Arctic, marked perhaps by a stone, a tower, a name, paths extending outward in multiple directions, not the edge of the world, but a junction. You let that image linger as sleep draws closer. The idea that roads once ran where no road should run does not feel shocking anymore. It feels inevitable. Because people, wherever they live, always find ways to move toward one another. And as you continue your journey through this quiet, frozen network, you carry a gentle certainty. Where there are roads, there are reasons to travel and reasons to return. You move onward from the quiet roads, and now the story turns toward faces, blurred, partial, never fully clear, yet unmistakably human. This is where you begin to meet the people behind the word. Not Tartaria as a place, not as a theory, but as a presence carried by individuals who once lived, worked, planned, and dreamed beneath Arctic skies. You do not encounter them all at once. They appear gradually in fragments. A sketch in a travel journal, a description in a diplomatic report, a passing reference to an official, an engineer, a guide. Their names are often missing, replaced by titles or roles, and yet their outlines feel distinct. You notice something immediately. These people are not described as desperate survivors. They are not portrayed as ragged or primitive. The language used for them, when it appears, is measured, calm, sometimes even respectful. They are called administrators, coordinators, keepers of routes, people responsible for systems rather than moments. You pause on that distinction. Survival cultures focus on immediacy. Systems-focused cultures think ahead. They plan, they anticipate, they build redundancy, and that is exactly what these figures seem to embody. You imagine a Tartarian official stationed far north, not as a conqueror, but as a caretaker. Someone tasked with maintaining balance rather than extracting wealth. Someone who understood that control in such an environment came not from force, but from cooperation with nature and people alike. You sense that leadership here looks different. Some figures are described as tall, composed, deliberate in movement. Others are noted for their quiet authority, their ability to organize labor without coercion. You are not asked to believe in giants or myths, only to notice that the descriptions do not align with caricatures of barbarians. You imagine councils rather than thrones, knowledge passed horizontally as much as vertically, expertise valued over lineage. These are impressions, not claims, but they persist gently. You notice references to engineers who travelled between regions, adapting designs to local conditions, people who understood materials deeply, who did not impose identical structures everywhere but modified them according to wind, light, and ground. This suggests a civilization that valued intelligence over uniformity. You think about how often history remembers kings and forgets builders, how often names survive only when attached to power, not function. It makes sense that these people would blur over time. They did not seek monumentality, they sought continuity. Some accounts mention guides who led travellers safely across ice, timing journeys precisely. These guides are not portrayed as mystics, but as experts. Their authority comes from knowledge, not superstition. You imagine learning under such a person, watching the sky, reading subtle changes in wind, knowing when not to travel, knowing when the ice would hold. This is not luck, it is study. You begin to sense that Tartarian identity, if it can be called that, was less about ethnicity and more about competence. A shared way of thinking, a shared respect for systems larger than oneself. This would explain how such a civilization could extend across diverse climates without collapsing into uniformity. It was adaptable, modular, calm. You notice how later accounts struggle to categorize these people. Are they rulers? Are they natives? Are they outsiders? The confusion itself is telling. They do not fit expected roles, and when people do not fit roles, they're often erased. You imagine the final generations of these Arctic Tartarians, not dramatic endings, not sudden collapse, just gradual thinning, fewer travellers, fewer apprentices, fewer hands to pass knowledge to. You imagine responsibility becoming heavier as population shrinks. You feel a quiet empathy, not sadness exactly, but recognition. History often ends civilizations loudly, wars, fires, invasions, but many end softly, through disconnection, through loss of context, through the slow failure of systems that required cooperation to function. You think about how easily such people would disappear into other populations, how their skills would be absorbed, their origins forgotten, a heating technique adopted here, a route remembered there, a design principle surviving without its name. You realize that Tartaria in this sense did not vanish. It dissolved. The Arctic, once a place of mastery, became a place of myth. The people became stories, then footnotes, then nothing at all. You let yourself sit with that for a moment. There is no anger in this story, no accusation, just the quiet acknowledgement that not all civilizations are remembered by monuments. Some are remembered only by how smoothly things once worked. You imagine one last figure standing beneath a tower, watching the sky, knowing that fewer people understand what it measures now, knowing that the knowledge will not survive intact, accepting that, and you imagine them turning away calmly, not in defeat, but in trust that something of what they built will endure, even if no one remembers their name. As you continue your journey, the faces fade again into the cold, but they leave behind a feeling, a sense of dignity, of restraint, of intelligence exercised without spectacle. You carry that feeling with you as sleep draws closer, because the people behind the word were not legends. They were not myths. They were simply human beings who understood their world deeply and lived quietly within it. You move onward, carrying the quiet presence of those people with you, and now the story softens into something more delicate. Culture, not laws, not systems, but the gentle things that remain when survival is no longer the only concern. This is where you begin to sense Tartarian life in the Arctic, not just as functional, but expressive. You encounter symbols first. They appear carved into stone, etched into metal, woven into fragments of fabric preserved by cold. Simple shapes at first, circles, stars, intersecting lines, but repeated with care. They are not random marks. They follow patterns, ratios, rhythms. You notice how often they mirror the sheet, rotations, crossings, cycles. You think about how people living under long polar nights would relate to the heavens differently. When the sun disappears, the stars become intimate, familiar. The sky turns into a clock, a calendar, a guide. Culture follows attention, and here attention was lifted upward. You imagine art that did not hang on walls but lived within architecture, patterns embedded into floors to guide movement, symbols placed at thresholds rather than altars, art not meant to be admired, but inhabited. You notice that these designs are rarely figurative. Few animals, few human forms. Instead, abstraction dominates. Geometry, flow, balance. This suggests a culture more concerned with principles than portraits. You let that sink in. In many societies, art celebrates power or identity. Here it seems to celebrate understanding, relationships between things, the way light moves, the way sound travels, the way seasons return even after darkness. You come across references to songs, quiet ones, Chants sung during long nights, not loudly, not performatively, but steadily. Rhythms designed to pace breath. Melodies meant to soothe rather than excite. You imagine these songs echoing softly inside enclosed spaces, harmonizing with wind outside. Music becomes a technology here, a way to regulate emotion, to maintain calm, to synchronize people during periods of confinement and cold. You realize how advanced that is, emotionally. You think about how modern societies underestimate the importance of psychological design, how often stress is treated as inevitable. But here it feels like mental balance was planned for, built into daily life. You imagine children learning patterns not as decoration, but as language, learning how shapes relate to time, how cycles repeat, how endings are not failures, but transitions. This culture feels unafraid of silence. You notice that there are few grand myths recorded. No loud origin stories, no dramatic gods battling chaos. Instead, there are quiet references to watchers, to keepers, to cycles larger than human drama. The tone is observational, not confrontational. You feel the lullaby rhythm deepen again. Some later observers describe this culture as austere, mistaking restraint for lack. But restraint is often a sign of maturity, of confidence, of not needing excess to feel meaning. You imagine festivals that are not explosions of sound, but moments of alignment, when the sky reaches a certain position, when light returns, when darkness peaks. Celebrations tied to reality, not fantasy. You think about how such a culture would be misunderstood by outsiders, how easily it would be labelled cold, emotionless, empty, when in fact it may have been deeply attuned, deeply calm. You sense that art here was not about leaving a mark on the world, but about tuning oneself to it. That is a dangerous idea for empires built on expansion. You notice again how little of this survives clearly. Songs are not written down, patterns lose meaning without context, symbols become decorative. What remains is often misinterpreted, and yet traces persist. You feel them in the repetition of motifs across distant regions, in shared geometric languages found far from the Arctic, in cultural echoes that suggest a once-connected worldview. You think again of Tartaria not as a political unit, but as a cultural frequency, a way of seeing the world that spread quietly, adapted locally, and left behind similar expressions even when names changed. You imagine sitting inside one of those Arctic structures, listening to a soft chant while wind moves outside. You feel no fear, no urgency, just continuity. This culture did not seek to conquer time, it sought to live within it. And perhaps that is why it faded so completely. Cultures that do not shout are often overwritten by those that do. As you prepare to move on, you carry with you a gentle impression rather than a fact. That somewhere in the Arctic, under ice and suns, there once existed a way of life that valued harmony over dominance, understanding over display. The symbols fade back into darkness, the songs quiet, but the feeling remains, soft, steady, and strangely comforting. You continue your journey, closer now to sleep, letting the culture of the North hum quietly in the background of your thoughts. You move onward gently, carrying the soft echo of songs and symbols, and now the story shifts again, not abruptly, not loudly, but with a subtle tightening of focus. This is where you encounter something that feels out of place in such a calm world. The idea of weapons. You have been lulled, perhaps deliberately, into imagining a peaceful Arctic civilization guided by balance and restraint. And that image still holds. But balance, you are reminded, does not mean vulnerability. Even the quietest cultures understand the need to protect what they have built. What surprises you is not that weapons existed here. It is how they are described. They are rarely emphasized, rarely celebrated, rarely illustrated. They appear in records almost reluctantly, as if mentioned only because a mission would be dishonest. And when they do appear, they do not resemble the tools of conquest you might expect. You notice that most references speak of defense, not expansion, of deterrence, not domination, structures reinforced in subtle ways, entry points designed to be controlled without appearing hostile, tools that could disable rather than destroy. You pause with that thought. In the Arctic, violence is inefficient, damage is hard to repair, resources are precious. A society that survives there would avoid conflict not out of idealism, but out of wisdom. And so, its defenses would be designed to end threats, quickly, quietly, with minimal disruption. You imagine barriers that look like ordinary architecture until approached incorrectly. Materials chosen not for aggression, but for resilience. Designs that channel movement rather than block it outright. You sense intelligence rather than intimidation. Some accounts mention weapons that do not rely on brute force, devices that use sound, pressure, balance, tools that disorient rather than wound. These descriptions are vague, often dismissed as exaggeration, but they linger uncomfortably in the margins. You do not imagine battlefield chaos. You imagine controlled encounters, warnings given, boundaries enforced, a culture that preferred prevention to punishment. You think about how modern narratives equate power with violence. But true power often lies in making violence unnecessary. The Arctic Tartarians, if that name still serves, seem to have understood this deeply. You notice that fortifications are rarely described as walls. Instead, there are references to zones, layers, gradual transitions from open to restricted space. This suggests a defensive philosophy based on awareness rather than isolation. You imagine someone approaching a settlement feeling watched long before they see anyone, not through fear but through design, through the subtle arrangement of land and structure. You recall the towers again and wonder whether some served dual purposes: observation, communication, deterrence without threat. Height offers perspective, not just advantage. There are hints, only hints, that some defensive systems interacted with the environment itself. Wind patterns altered, sound carried intentionally, ice used strategically. The land becomes part of the defense, not an obstacle to overcome. You feel a quiet admiration for this approach. Later observers, unfamiliar with such methods, struggle to interpret them. They expect weapons to look a certain way, to announce themselves. When they do not, they are overlooked, or labelled ceremonial, or misunderstood entirely. You realise how easy it would be to miss a defence system designed to blend in. You think again of Tartaria's vast reach, and how such a culture would have encountered threats, not only from outside, but from imbalance within. Defence is not always external. Sometimes it is about maintaining internal harmony. You imagine rules enforced not through fear, but through structure, through systems that made harmful behaviour difficult rather than punished it harshly. Architecture as ethics, design as discipline. You notice how few accounts describe battles, how rare it is to find references to bloodshed in these northern records. This absence is not proof of peace, but it suggests that conflict was not the defining feature, and that in itself is unusual. You consider how history remembers warriors and forgets guardians, how aggression makes for better stories than restraint. It becomes easier to erase a culture that did not leave behind dramatic ruins of war. You imagine a final period of pressure, outsiders arriving with different assumptions, expecting submission or chaos, finding instead a system that does not respond as expected, not easily provoked, not easily conquered. You imagine misunderstandings escalating, defensive systems misread as hostility, restraint interpreted as weakness. You do not dramatize it, you let it remain quiet, unresolved. The Arctic, after all, does not rush. You feel the lullaby rhythm deepen again. The idea of weapons fades back into the larger context of protection, of care, of responsibility. These were not tools of domination. They were tools of preservation, and perhaps that is why they were so easily dismissed. A world obsessed with power struggles rarely recognizes power that does not seek attention. You realize that this civilization's greatest defense may not have been any device or structure, but its refusal to play familiar games, its unwillingness to define itself through conflict. As you continue your journey, you feel no tension from this section, only a steady reassurance. The understanding that peace does not mean unguarded, that quiet does not mean defenseless. The Arctic wind settles again. The imagined weapons rest unseen, unused, patient, and you move on, knowing now that even the calmest civilizations prepare not to conquer the world, but to protect their place within it. You move onward, leaving behind the quiet defences, and now your gaze lifts again, this time not to towers or walls, but to the sky itself. This is where the Arctic reveals one of its deepest secrets, because here, more than anywhere else on Earth, the heavens do not behave as you expect them to. You are standing near the pole now, in a place where direction blurs, where compasses hesitate, where the sky does not rise and set in familiar arcs, but circles slowly, deliberately, like a great turning wheel. And you begin to understand why this place would matter to anyone who measured time. The records change tone here. They grow attentive, observant, precise. You find references to repeated sky watchings, to markings aligned not with sunrise or sunset, but with stars that never leave the sky, to calendars that do not rely on months as you know them, but on cycles of light and darkness, presence and absence. You imagine a civilization that lived by a different clock. In the Arctic, the sun does not gently mark each day. It disappears, it returns. Time stretches, compresses, loses its usual shape. To survive psychologically, let alone culturally, people would need a deeper framework. Something steady when daily rhythm collapses, so you imagine them turning to the sky. You picture observers standing within towers or open circles, watching auroras ripple like living curtains, measuring their timing, their intensity, their direction. You imagine stars used not for navigation alone, but for scheduling life itself, harvests, journeys, gatherings, rest. You realize how much trust this requires, how much long-term observation, how many generations watching patiently, comparing notes, refining understanding. This is not astrology as superstition. This is astronomy as survival. You notice that some Arctic structures align perfectly with celestial events that only occur at extreme latitudes. Moments when the sky does something rare, something brief, something that would go unnoticed elsewhere. These alignments feel intentional, not decorative. You let that realization settle gently. You think about how many ancient cultures treated certain locations as world centers, places where heaven and earth felt closer. The pole, with its unmoving stars and rotating sky, would naturally feel like such a place, not symbolically, but mechanically. Here, the sky turns around you. You imagine Tartarian knowledge, if that word still fits, understanding this deeply. Using the pole as a reference point, a stabilizer, a cosmic anchor, time measured not by chaos, but by slow, predictable motion. You notice hints that calendars used here were shared outward, influencing regions far from the Arctic. Subtle similarities, shared cycle lengths, matching symbolic counts. This suggests that the Arctic was not just receiving knowledge, but generating it. You feel a quiet shift in perspective. What if the North was not a fringe, but a clock tower for the world? What if those who lived closest to the pole understood time more clearly than those closer to the equator? You do not rush to accept this. You simply let it exist as a possibility. Some records mention that certain ceremonies, or perhaps better, calibrations, took place at specific polar moments, when darkness reached its deepest point, when light returned. These were not celebrations in the usual sense. They were acknowledgements, markers of continuity. You imagine the emotional effect of this? Living through months of darkness without fear because you trust the cycle, because you have measured it, because you know, not hope, that light will return. That kind of certainty is powerful. You think about how modern society, for all its technology, often feels untethered from time, rushed, fragmented, always late. And you contrast that with a culture that oriented itself to the slowest, largest motions available. You begin to sense why this knowledge would be difficult to preserve. It requires patience, stillness, attention over spectacle. These are not traits that dominate eras of expansion. You notice that later explorers often describe Arctic sky phenomena with awe, but without understanding. The aurora becomes magic. The long day becomes curiosity. The long night becomes terror. What was once integrated becomes exotic. You imagine knowledge slipping from practice into myth. The sky calendar remains, but no one knows how to read it fully anymore. Alignments become ruins. Markers become decorations. Meaning fades. And yet the sky itself does not forget. You feel the story slowing again, widening. The pole is not just a location now, it is an idea. Stability amid motion, center amid rotation. You imagine standing beneath that turning sky, breathing slowly, feeling small but not insignificant, knowing that your life fits into a rhythm far older and far larger than yourself. This perhaps was the greatest gift of the Arctic civilization. Not technology, not architecture, not trade, but perspective. The understanding that time is not an enemy, that cycles do not rush, that endings are simply points of return. As you move onward, closer to sleep, you carry this feeling with you, a sense of being held within something vast and orderly. The sky above the Arctic continues its silent turning. The ancient calendar remains written in light and darkness, and even now, whether we remember how to read it or not, it keeps time, patient, precise, and unbroken. You move onward from the sky, and now the story descends again, back toward the ground, back toward what the ice itself has been guarding. This is where the records grow uneasy, where language falters, where observers hesitate before writing anything at all. This is where creatures enter the story. And bones, not myths at first, not legends, just notes, measurements, descriptions that do not quite fit the expected scale. You encounter reports of remains uncovered during thaws or excavations, bones larger than anticipated, heavier than familiar anatomy would suggest. Limbs too long, joints too broad, skulls described carefully, almost nervously, with comparisons rather than conclusions, larger than usual. Uncommon proportion, difficult to classify. You let the words rest without forcing them to mean more than they say. The Arctic is a place where preservation defies time. Cold slows decay. Ice protects shape. A body lost elsewhere dissolves into soil. A body lost here can wait centuries to be seen again. And so, when something emerges, it emerges intact enough to be unsettling. You imagine explorers standing over such finds, unsure how to respond. They are not hunters discovering prey. They are witnesses encountering contradiction. The kind of contradiction that does not shout but quietly unsettles everything you thought you knew about scale. You notice that these finds are rarely celebrated, rarely displayed, often reburied, or removed quietly, or described briefly and then forgotten. The language around them feels cautious, as if the writers are unsure whether such things should be recorded at all. You begin to sense a familiar pattern. Some accounts suggest these remains belong to people of great height. Others suggest they were not human at all, but animals now extinct, adapted to cold in ways we no longer recognize. Massive bears, unknown ungulates, creatures that do not fit neatly into modern classifications. You do not rush to decide, you allow ambiguity. You think about how little we truly know about ancient ecosystems, especially in regions assumed to be lifeless. If a civilization thrived here, its environment may have been richer, more diverse, more supportive than we imagine. Life adapts in ways that surprise us, and yet some descriptions refuse to stay purely zoological. There are mentions of tools found near oversized remains, of structures scaled larger than average human dimensions, of doorways unusually tall, of steps spaced farther apart. Again, each detail alone is easy to dismiss. Together they create unease. You do not imagine giants striding dramatically across ice. The story does not ask that of you. Instead, it asks something quieter. What if human variation was once broader than we accept today? What if certain populations adapted physically to extreme environments over long periods? Cold shapes bodies. Nutrition shapes growth. Environment shapes possibility. You think about how modern humans have narrowed diversity through displacement, famine, and standardization. How many forms of humanity may have existed that no longer do? The Arctic, once again, feels like a vault rather than a void. You notice how often later scholars respond to these finds with embarrassment. Bones are relabeled, measurements adjusted, context ignored. The word misidentified appears frequently, like a blanket pulled over something uncomfortable. You feel no accusation in this, only caution. Extraordinary claims demand extraordinary care, and yet extraordinary dismissals demand care as well. The easiest way to avoid a question is to declare it resolved prematurely. You imagine the people of the Arctic civilization encountering such beings, whether as ancestors, neighbors, or simply fellow inhabitants of the same land. You imagine coexistence without spectacle, without mythologizing, just life as it was. Perhaps size was not remarkable then, perhaps difference was normal. You think again of the architecture, of tall towers, of large-scale planning, of systems that seem overbuilt for small populations. You let the possibility hover gently without naming it. The records also speak of animals that no longer exist, creatures adapted to colder, more stable climates, animals whose bones suggest strength rather than speed, endurance rather than aggression. These would have been companions to human life, not obstacles. You imagine a world where megafauna lingered longer in the north, where extinction arrived not suddenly but gradually, as climate shifted, as systems failed, as people disappeared. The idea of a sudden catastrophe has been whispered before: flood, mud, freeze. But here, you sense something slower, a fading. You think about how bones, more than ruins, frighten historians. Stone can be misinterpreted, tools can be reclassified, but bones insist on physical reality. They demand measurement. They confront assumptions directly, and so they are often moved out of sight. You notice how many of these discoveries are reported by non-specialists: explorers, workers, travellers, people without the authority to define meaning. Their accounts sit in the margins, unintegrated into official narratives. You imagine how different the story might look if those voices had been centred rather than sidelined. You let the lullaby rhythm return because this is not a story meant to disturb you. It is meant to widen you, to remind you that humanity's past may be stranger, richer, and more varied than the narrow version we repeat. You imagine the Arctic ground settling again, bones returning to stillness, ice sealing the memory gently rather than violently. Nothing here is angry, nothing demands belief. The creatures, human or otherwise, do not haunt. They rest. And as you move onward, you carry one quiet understanding. The Arctic does not just preserve buildings and tools, it preserves questions. Questions about who lived here, how they lived, and how different the past may have been from the story we tell ourselves to feel secure. The snow falls again in your mind, soft and even. The bones sleep, and you continue your journey, unafraid. You move onward, and something changes in the air. The story does not grow louder or darker, it grows thinner, quieter, as if sound itself is being removed layer by layer. This is where you begin to notice not what is present in the records, but what is missing. This is where silence becomes evidence. You are now walking through gaps. You notice how, after a certain point, the Arctic begins to fade from official memory. Not gradually, not naturally, but unevenly. Some years are richly described, others vanish entirely. Regions that once had names are suddenly reduced to blank space or vague labels like uninhabited or unknown. You pause with that word, unknown. Unknown does not mean empty, it means unspoken. You begin comparing documents from different eras, and the contrast feels deliberate. Earlier texts describe populations, trade, structures. Later ones speak only of climate, danger, impossibility. The people are gone, not because they are proven not to exist, but because they are no longer mentioned. You feel the presence of editing. Whole categories disappear. Administrative districts become wilderness. Cultural references become folklore. Names become mistakes. The Arctic is slowly transformed from a place of life into a place of myth. You imagine a hand moving through archives, not tearing pages out violently, but choosing which ones to copy forward. History often survives through repetition. What is not recopied fades. What is not taught dissolves. You realize how quiet erasure really is. No announcement is made, no correction issued. The narrative simply shifts. Students learn a simplified version. Cartographers redraw. Scholars stop asking certain questions because the framework no longer supports them. You think about how knowledge depends on continuity. Break the chain once, and everything before it becomes unreliable. Not because it is false, but because it no longer fits. You notice how the word Tartaria itself begins to shrink. Once expansive, once matter-of-fact, it becomes ambiguous, then controversial, then obsolete. Finally, it is framed as a misunderstanding, an error of old geography. You let that progression settle. You realize that erasure does not require proof. It requires authority. Whoever controls classification controls memory. Label something myth, and curiosity dissolves. Label it error, and investigation stops. You think about how many questions die this way, not through answers, but through dismissal. You notice that Arctic discoveries made later are treated in isolation. A ruin here, a bone there, a tool elsewhere, never connected, never contextualized. Each one explained away individually, so that no larger pattern can form. This fragmentation feels intentional, even if no single person intended it. You imagine a time of upheaval, empires restructuring, borders hardening, New narratives required to justify control. A vast, advanced northern civilization would complicate too much. It would blur lines between civilized and primitive, between center and periphery. Silence becomes convenient. You feel no anger about this, only a slow, deep understanding. History is not malicious by default. It is shaped by needs, and sometimes the need for a clean story outweighs the need for a true one. You imagine scholars encountering contradictions and choosing simpler explanations, not out of deceit, but fatigue. Paradigms are heavy. Questioning them can cost careers, reputations, stability. You think again of the Arctic as a locked room, not locked with chains, but with assumptions. Cold equals empty, ice equals death. End of discussion. And yet, you are here, walking through what remains unsaid. You notice how oral histories from northern peoples often contradict official records. Stories of cities under ice, of old ways lost suddenly, of knowledge taken or forgotten. These stories are labelled legend, even when they align across vast distances. You sense how uncomfortable consistency can be. You imagine generations growing up without knowing what their ancestors once maintained, using remnants without understanding origin, living among ruins and thinking they are natural. This kind of forgetting is gentle, almost merciful. It does not hurt. It simply fades. The silence grows thicker here, but not oppressive. It feels like snowfall at night, muting sound, softening edges. The story is not accusing anyone. It is showing you how easily entire worlds can vanish without drama. You think about how much of your own life will leave no trace, how memory itself is selective. This realization does not frighten you. It calms you. You understand now that the disappearance of Arctic Tartaria, if that is what it was, is not a mystery in the dramatic sense. It is a lesson in how fragile remembrance is. You sit with that quietly. Silence does not always mean nothing happened. Sometimes it means too much happened, and the simplest response was to stop speaking. As you move onward, you feel the story preparing to shift again. The silence has done its work. It has cleared space. It has slowed your thoughts. And in that quiet, a new question begins to form. Not about what was erased, but about why. The Arctic remains still. The pages remain blank. But now you know. Blankness can be written deliberately. You continue forward, gently, carrying the weight of what is not said. You move onward from the silence, and now the story begins to change texture again. Not louder, not sharper, but heavier, as if the air itself has thickened. This is where the records stop fading quietly and begin to hint at disruption. Not invasion, not war, something more indifferent, something that does not care who you are or what you built. This is where you encounter mud, flood, and sudden winter. The accounts here feel different, urgent but confused. Observations written by people who did not yet have language for what they were witnessing. Rivers behaving strangely, ground-swallowing structures. Entire districts described as buried rather than destroyed. And above all, the sense of speed. You pause with that idea. Civilizations usually decline slowly. Roads crack, systems fail, knowledge thins. But these descriptions suggest interruption, a before and an after separated by very little time, as if something shifted suddenly and did not ask permission. You find references to land that was once dry becoming impassable, to buildings filled not with rubble, but with fine sediment, as if poured, to lower levels disappearing first, to cities sinking rather than collapsing. This is not the language of decay, it is the language of overwhelm. You imagine heavy rains falling where frozen ground could not absorb them, permafrost destabilizing, rivers overflowing their ancient paths, mud moving like liquid stone, slow but unstoppable. You imagine people trying to save what they could, not yet understanding that the land itself was changing. You think about how fragile even the most advanced systems become when foundational assumptions fail. Some records describe cold intensifying rapidly after these events, longer winters, shorter summers, ice forming where water once flowed, a sudden hardening of the world. This would not just inconvenience life, it would reorganize it completely. You begin to sense that the Arctic you imagine today may not be the Arctic they knew. What if the cold arrived after the collapse, not before it? What if the ice sealed the story only after it ended? You do not rush to claim this as fact, you simply let the sequence rest in your mind. Flood, burial, freeze. Mud becomes permafrost. Cities become layers. Silence follows. You think again of the heating systems, the towers, the roads, how quickly they would become useless if ground stability failed, how systems dependent on balance would suffer most when balance vanished. You imagine a civilization built for continuity facing a reality that no longer honoured cycles, a sky that still turned, but a land that no longer responded as expected. You notice that later records often compress this period into vagueness. Harsh climate, natural disaster, migration, words that explain nothing and close the conversation. But earlier notes suggest something sharper, a sense of shock. You feel no drama in this, only inevitability. Nature does not negotiate, it does not target, it simply shifts, and when it does, even the most thoughtful civilizations must adapt or move or fade. You imagine survivors abandoning buried cities, moving southward, carrying what knowledge they could. You imagine systems breaking not through violence, but through misalignment with a new reality. This would explain the sudden thinning of records, the disappearance of populations without war, the absorption of people into other cultures without conquest. Refugees do not leave monuments, they leave traces. You think about how mud floods have erased modern cities in moments, how fragile concrete becomes when water and earth conspire. Now imagine stone cities built with patience, undone not by fire, but by saturation. You let the image soften. You realize that catastrophe does not always announce itself as apocalypse. Sometimes it arrives as inconvenience that never leaves, a season that does not end, a road that never dries, a river that no longer returns to its banks. You imagine elders saying it will pass until it doesn't. The Arctic today feels permanent, eternal, but permanence is often an illusion created by forgetting what came before. You begin to understand why the ice feels so quiet, why it preserves rather than erodes, why it feels like a lid rather than a grave. It arrived after the story was already closing. You feel a deep calm here, not fear. The idea of sudden change does not alarm you. It humbles you. It reminds you that intelligence is not immunity. As you move onward, the catastrophe fades back into stillness. The mud settles, the water freezes, the cities sleep, and you carry with you one gentle realization. The end of the Arctic civilization may not have been caused by enemies or failure, but by a world that changed faster than wisdom could adapt. The snow falls again, smooth and even. The disruption becomes memory. And you continue your journey, aware now that silence can follow not just erasure, but survival. You move onward from the frozen aftermath, and the story shifts again, not toward endings, but toward continuity. Because civilizations rarely vanish completely. They scatter. They fragment. They leave survivors. And this is where you begin to sense them, not as builders of towers or keepers of calendars, but as people moving quietly into other worlds. You are now listening for orphans. The records here do not speak openly. They hint, they suggest, they trail off. You find references to new settlers appearing suddenly in regions farther south, groups with unfamiliar skills, unusual knowledge of building, an ease with cold that seems out of place. They arrive without clear origin stories, as if their past has been gently folded away. You pause with that image. Imagine leaving a land that no longer holds you, not because it rejects you, but because it has changed beyond recognition. Imagine carrying knowledge that no one around you asked for or knew how to use fully, knowledge that only made sense in a place that no longer exists. You imagine these survivors integrating slowly, quietly, taking roles as builders, engineers, guides, their expertise valued, their history unexamined. Over time, their children speak new languages. Their old names soften, their identity dissolves into function. This is how civilizations disappear without violence. You notice how often later empires suddenly acquire infrastructure that seems ahead of its time. Heating techniques, road designs, urban layouts that appear fully formed rather than experimental. These are often attributed to genius individuals or lucky innovation, but you begin to wonder whether they were inheritances instead. You think about how knowledge migrates more easily than people. A technique taught here, a method copied there, stripped of context, renamed, repurposed. The origin forgotten because the utility remains. You imagine Tartarian survivors watching their ideas live on under new banners. You imagine pride mixed with loss, satisfaction mixed with silence. You imagine choosing not to explain everything because explanation invites questions, and questions can invite danger. You realize how often history credits new masters for what they adopt rather than create. The winners of transitions write the narratives. The displaced rarely argue. You notice how certain architectural styles appear suddenly, across vast regions, without clear development phases. How standardized elements show up fully realized. This suggests not invention, but transfer. You imagine children growing up inside buildings designed by people whose names they will never know, benefiting from systems whose logic they do not fully understand, living comfortably within the residue of another civilization. You feel no bitterness in this, only inevitability. You think about how survivors adapt by becoming invisible, by blending, by letting their uniqueness soften until it no longer draws attention. This is not defeat, it is strategy. The Arctic survivors would have learned this well. Silence kept them alive before, silence would keep them alive again. You notice how northern knowledge is often attributed vaguely to ancient wisdom or lost traditions without specificity. This vagueness protects both the knowledge and those who carried it. You imagine elders choosing which parts to pass on and which to let go, teaching techniques without stories, skills without context. Because context carries risk. You think again of the heating systems, of road alignments, of sky awareness. How much of that could survive as instinct rather than explanation, as habit rather than doctrine? You realize that many modern practices may be echoes rather than inventions. The idea does not threaten you. It soothes you. It suggests continuity rather than loss. That even when civilizations fade, their understanding does not vanish entirely. It flows onward, diluted but persistent. You imagine Tartaria not as something that was conquered, but as something that diffused, like warmth spreading from a hearth long after the fire itself has gone out. You notice that official histories rarely dwell on absorption. They prefer conquest, because it has clear winners. Absorption blurs lines. It complicates pride. You imagine a new empire rising on land warmed by someone else's forgotten knowledge. You imagine that empire believing it stands alone. You do not judge this. It is simply how stories simplify themselves over time. You feel the lullaby rhythm deepen again. This section is not about loss. It is about survival in its quietest form. You think about your own ancestry. How much of who you are comes from people you will never name? Skills passed down unconsciously, preferences inherited without explanation, knowledge disguised as intuition. You begin to sense Tartaria everywhere and nowhere at once, not as a place but as a residue, a way of solving problems, a way of thinking ahead, a way of living with environment rather than against it. The Arctic survivors do not demand recognition. They do not need monuments. Their success is that you do not notice them at all. You imagine them watching centuries pass, seeing the world grow louder, faster, more aggressive. Perhaps some of their calm persists in pockets, in remote villages, in architectural oddities, in cultural habits that resist explanation. You feel a gentle respect for that endurance. As you continue your journey, you are no longer looking for ruins. You are looking for continuity, for traces embedded in ordinary life, for systems that work too smoothly to have been invented in haste. You realize now that the disappearance of Tartaria from the Arctic does not mean it ended. It means it changed form. And as sleep draws closer, that realization feels comforting rather than unsettling, because it suggests that wisdom, once discovered, rarely disappears completely. It simply waits quietly for a world ready to notice it again. You move onward, and now the story tilts gently into a realm that feels familiar, even if you've tried to keep it at a distance. This is where speculation returns, not as spectacle, but as a quiet echo that has followed you all along. The ancient alien's question does not burst into the room. It simply takes a seat beside you. You have noticed by now how often the records hesitate, how frequently observers describe technology without understanding mechanism, how structures appear purposeful but oddly timeless, how knowledge seems to arrive fully formed, then vanish without trace. These are the conditions under which another idea always emerges. You let it emerge slowly. What if the Arctic civilization did not develop entirely alone? This is not a claim. It is a thought experiment, one that has visited many cultures before. When humans encounter sophistication that does not match their expectations, they often look upward, not out of foolishness, but out of humility, because sometimes the gap feels too wide to bridge comfortably. You think again of the towers, their vertical reach, their possible interaction with atmosphere and sky. You think of the sky calendar, aligned with movements most humans rarely observe closely. You think of tools whose purpose seems environmental rather than mechanical. And you ask yourself, quietly, could help have come from above? If it did, it would not need to look like invasion. It would not need ships or conquest. Teaching is far more efficient than ruling. A small group of instructors, observers, engineers, arriving, sharing knowledge, then leaving, would leave behind exactly the kind of traces you've been following. Knowledge without origin stories, systems without blueprints, effects without explanations. You notice that many ancient traditions speak not of gods demanding worship, but of watchers who taught, who measured, who corrected calendars, who showed people how to build in harmony with the world rather than against it. You imagine such visitors finding the Arctic ideal, remote, stable, aligned with the planetary forces, close to magnetic and celestial peculiarities, a place where experiments could unfold quietly without interference. You do not imagine them as saviors, that is a human projection. You imagine them as curious, observational, interested in cycles, balance, resilience. You think about how much of Tartarian culture emphasized harmony, restraint, integration. Those are not traits of conquerors, they are traits of teachers. If knowledge was shared, not imposed, it would blend seamlessly into local culture. Over generations, the distinction between given and developed would disappear. The knowledge would simply be normal, and when catastrophe struck, flood, mud, freeze, those teachers may have left, or died, or withdrawn. Knowledge that is not fully internalized does not survive disruption well. You feel no excitement in this idea, only a strange calm. You realize that the ancient aliens hypothesis persists not because people want mystery, but because it fills a silence left by incomplete explanations. It asks questions when conventional narratives stop asking. You also realize that it's often ridiculed not because it is dangerous, but because it is destabilizing. It suggests that humanity's story may not be entirely self-contained, that we may have been students at some point, not just inventors. You sit with that gently. You imagine Tartaria as a collaboration rather than an origin, a culture that absorbed and refined knowledge, then adapted it uniquely to Earth's most extreme environments. That would explain both its sophistication and its restraint. You notice how few myths survive that glorify these teachers. No grand temples, no eternal gods, just quiet references to those who came before or those who showed the way. This suggests gratitude without dependence. You think again of the Arctic towers, standing long after their builders vanished. Perhaps they were not meant to last forever. Perhaps they were meant to teach, then become irrelevant. You feel a subtle shift here. The ancient aliens idea, instead of diminishing humanity, begins to elevate it. Because learning is not weakness. Curiosity is not failure. Adaptation is not shame. If help arrived once, it does not mean it will arrive again. Perhaps the lesson was meant to be absorbed, not repeated. You do not imagine dramatic returns or hidden bases beneath the ice. That is not the tone of this story. The tone is quieter, more intimate, more human. You imagine that if such watchers existed, they would not be offended by forgetting. Forgetting is part of growth, part of independence, part of becoming something new. You think about how children eventually outgrow teachers, how lessons remain even when names fade. The Arctic civilization then becomes a chapter in humanity's education, a place where knowledge was tested under the harshest conditions, a proof that harmony with environment was possible, even in ice. You feel no need to decide whether this idea is true. This section is not about belief, it is about permission. Permission to consider that history may be layered, collaborative, and stranger than pride prefers. As you move onward, the sky above the Arctic feels vast again, empty perhaps, or perhaps simply quiet. Either way, the question lingers softly, without demanding resolution. What if humanity has never been entirely alone? And what if that was always meant to be a comfort, not a threat? The wind settles, the thought drifts, and you continue your journey, unburdened by certainty, content to wander together. You move onward, and now the story no longer feels like it belongs only to the Arctic, or to Tartaria, or even to the past. It begins to turn gently toward you. This is where the journey stops being about what existed and starts asking what it means. You have followed cities into ice, knowledge into silence, people into disappearance. And now a larger question rises, not suddenly, not forcefully, but naturally, as if it has been waiting for you to be ready. If a civilization could thrive where none should exist, what does that say about the limits you've been taught to accept? You think about how often humanity is described as fragile, dependent, barely surviving against nature. And yet, the story you've been walking through suggests something else entirely. It suggests adaptability so deep that it reshaped impossible environments into homes. You let that contrast settle. You realize that history often trains you to think small, to believe that progress moves in straight lines, that knowledge accumulates steadily, that each generation is smarter than the last. But the Arctic story refuses that simplicity. Here, knowledge appears, peaks, integrates, and then dissolves. Not because it failed, but because conditions changed. Intelligence did not vanish. Context did. You begin to wonder how much of modern life depends not on superiority, but on circumstance. How much of what you call advancement is merely alignment with a temporary environment. You think again of Tartaria, not as a lost empire to mourn, but as a reminder. A reminder that humanity has solved problems before in ways that did not rely on domination, extraction, or excess. A reminder that resilience does not always look loud. You ask yourself quietly, if those people were capable of such balance, why did we choose a different path? The question is not accusation, it is curiosity. You think about how modern civilization treats the Earth, as resource, as obstacle, as backdrop, and you contrast that with a culture that treated environment as partner, one that built with cycles rather than against them. You begin to see the Arctic not as a tragedy, but as a mirror. Perhaps the reason this story unsettles is not because it suggests something hidden, but because it suggests something possible. A different way of being human that does not fit neatly into current power structures. You realize how much of history is written to justify the present. If the past contains examples of sustainable harmony, it challenges the idea that exploitation is inevitable. You think about how quickly the Arctic story was simplified, emptied, forgotten. Because complexity invites responsibility, you let your breathing slow. You consider that humanity may not be on a single upward path, but on many overlapping ones. Some abandoned, some forgotten, some waiting quietly to be rediscovered and used it when circumstances demand them again. You think about climate, about instability, about change arriving faster than systems can adapt. And suddenly, the Arctic civilization no longer feels distant. It feels relevant. They too faced sudden shifts. They too had to decide what to carry forward and what to let go. They too discovered that intelligence alone does not guarantee survival, only adaptability does. You feel no despair in this, only clarity. The story of Tartaria in the Arctic does not tell you that humanity was once greater and is now lesser. It tells you that humanity is cyclical, that wisdom rises, spreads, fades, and returns in new forms. You begin to understand that forgetting is not always failure. Sometimes it is rest, sometimes it is incubation. You think about how many ideas are dismissed today because they do not align with dominant narratives. How many solutions are labelled unrealistic simply because they do not maximize control or profit. You wonder what future historians will erase about your time. The Arctic ice remains quiet in your imagination, but it no longer feels empty. It feels observant, as if it has seen this pattern before. Rise, balance, disruption, forgetting, relearning. You realize that the grand question is not whether Tartaria existed exactly as described. The grand question is this: what kind of civilization do you believe humans are capable of becoming? One that burns through resources and calls it progress, or one that integrates, adapts, and listens? You feel no pressure to answer. This section is not here to resolve the mystery. It is here to widen it, so that it includes you. You are not a passive listener now. You are part of the story's continuation. The same choices echo forward, dressed in new language, new technology, new urgency. The Arctic stands as a reminder that impossibility is often a narrative choice. As you prepare to take the final steps of this journey, you feel something settle inside you. Not belief, not skepticism, but openness. The meaning of humanity, perhaps, is not dominance or endurance, but learning. learning how to live within limits without shrinking, learning how to remember without clinging, learning how to build without forgetting how to listen. The snow falls softly again, the question remains open, and you move forward, carrying it gently, ready for the final quiet walk into white. You move onward one last time, and now the world grows quieter than it has been at any point in this journey. There is no new evidence waiting ahead, no new record to uncover, only the white horizon, stretching endlessly, gently, as if inviting you not to search anymore, but to rest. You are walking toward the Arctic edge again, the same place where you began, but it no longer feels empty, it feels complete. You carry everything with you now, the maps that once spoke, the names that refused to die, the ledgers that counted lives, the buried streets, the towers that reached upward, the warmth that should not have existed, the tools shaped with care, the roads worn smooth by return, the people who lived quietly, the symbols and songs, the defences that did not seek glory, the sky that kept time, the bones that asked questions, the silence that erased without anger, the catastrophe that arrived without intent, the survivors who blended into new worlds, the possibility that humanity was never entirely alone, and finally, the question of what all of this means for you. You realise now that the Arctic was never the end of the world, it was a test, a place where assumptions failed, where extremes demanded intelligence rather than force, where civilization could not hide behind abundance, only behind understanding. And for a time, perhaps a long time, humanity passed that test. You stop walking, you stand still in the white, breathing slowly, and you feel no need to prove anything. The story does not ask you to believe. It does not ask you to argue. It only asks you to notice how fragile certainty is and how resilient quiet wisdom can be. You think about how many stories end with fire or conquest, how few end with snow and silence, but silence is not nothing. Silence is rest. Silence is preservation. Silence is the space where new stories wait to be told. You imagine the Arctic holding memory the way a mother holds a sleeping child. Not tightly, not possessively, just patiently, allowing time to pass without judgment. You understand now why this story is best told at night. Because night is when the mind loosens its grip on control, when questions feel less threatening, when mystery becomes companionship rather than danger. You feel the journey slowing, like a heartbeat settling. Perhaps Tartaria was real exactly as described. Perhaps it was different. Perhaps it was many things at once. The truth is less important than the invitation it offers, to imagine humanity as more adaptable, more thoughtful, more capable of harmony than we are often told. You realize that civilizations do not disappear because they were weak. They disappear because the world changes and because memory is selective. But ideas have a way of returning when they are needed. You feel the snow under your feet soften, not melt. The wind grows gentler. The white becomes less blinding, more comforting. The Arctic no longer feels like exile. It feels like a library closed for the night. And now the story knows it is time to let you go. The pace slows even more now. Your thoughts stretch, lengthen, soften, like shadows at dusk. You no longer need to hold the images sharply, let them blur, let the towers fade into silhouettes. Let the roads dissolve into smooth lines beneath snow. Let the songs quiet until they are only breath. You are safe here. The questions do not need answers tonight. They can rest beside you, folded neatly, like maps waiting to be opened another day. The Arctic does not demand resolution. It offers stillness. You feel the weight of history lifting, not because it is gone, but because you no longer need to carry it actively. The ice carries it now. The silence carries it. Time carries it. Your breathing becomes slower, deeper, each inhale cool and clean, each exhale warm and steady. The story wraps around you like a blanket woven from memory and calm. Whatever existed in the Arctic, cities, people, knowledge, it has already given you its gift. A reminder that humanity's story is wider than fear, deeper than domination, and quieter than we expect. You do not need to stay awake to protect this knowledge. It is not fragile. It has survived ice, silence, and forgetting. It will survive sleep. The white world fades gently, not into darkness, but into softness, like falling snow seen through half-closed eyes. And as the final images dissolve, as the last thought drifts away, the night speaks kindly to you without words. End of script. Sweet dreams.